Hello and welcome back to GCSE History Lessons. In this lesson we will look at the lead up to the invasion of Czechoslovakia, most notably the Prague Spring. By the end of the lesson you should understand the reason for reforms in 1960s Czechoslovakia and understand the key events of the Prague Spring. You will remember from previous lessons that during Khrushchev's leadership, the process of de-Stalinization had led to reform in Eastern Europe, as states in the Soviet sphere were encouraged to develop communist economies in their own way. This eventually led to a revolution in Hungary in 1956, which Khrushchev used force to crush. When Khrushchev denounced Stalin and his policies yet again in the 22nd Soviet Party Congress in October 1961, there was another wave of reform across Eastern Europe. Countries gave greater freedoms to academics in universities and also the media. But one nation in Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, had been under hardline communist rule when Khrushchev's de-Stalinization was taking place, and so the tensions and pressure to reform were not addressed like they had been in Hungary earlier. We know from last lesson that Khrushchev was replaced by Brezhnev in 1964. Unlike Khrushchev, Brezhnev wouldn't tolerate as much freedom and suggested a system of polycentrism, meaning communist states in Eastern Europe should follow the Moscow-style communism in their own countries, but not be directly controlled by Moscow. The new doctrine was vague and slightly threatening towards Eastern European countries. What was able to be reformed and what was to be in line with Moscow was uncertain. And moreover, what Brezhnev would do if he felt a country was straying from the USSR's ideology was also uncertain. Some countries, such as Albania and Romania, had a problem with this and began to split from the USSR. However, being mainly agricultural states on the outskirts of the Soviet sphere of influence in Europe, Brezhnev didn't react too strongly to Albanian and Romanian protests or reforms. But for a state like Czechoslovakia, the most industrially developed state in Eastern Europe, it would be a different story. During the early 1960s, Czechoslovakia was troubled by an economic slowdown as urbanization, that is, the process of people moving from the farm to the cities, slowed. This meant countries could no longer grow their economy simply by employing more peasants in factories. They now needed to become more efficient if they wanted their economy to continue growing. The economic slowdown happened all across Eastern Europe at the time, but the situation in Czechoslovakia was especially bad. In 1962, Czechoslovakian industrial output actually fell 0.4%. To compare, Spain's industrial output at the beginning of 1962 was around 15%. Japan's was 17%. The situation was so bad in Czechoslovakia that restaurants were forced to have meat-free days to save on costs. The hardline Czech leader, Antonin Novotný, was humiliated by various events of the early 1960s. Firstly, the economic downturn forced Novotny's government to abandon its third five-year plan and give in to some reforms. This then led to further humiliation when the 12th Czech Party Congress agreed in December 1962 to investigate political purges by his government in the 1950s, which Novotny had previously denied. This set off a wide public debate about liberalising society, and some even called into question the role of the Communist Party in Czech society. Novotny tried to regain support in 1967 by demonising the large Slovak minority who made up 30% of Czechoslovakia's total 14 million people. But when Brezhnev told Novotny that the USSR would not interfere with Czechoslovakian domestic politics, Novotny was forced to resign as party secretary in January 1968. Novotny was still Czechoslovakian president, but he was succeeded as party secretary by Alexander Dubček, the Slovak party leader and reformer. Dubček was a sincere communist who believed in the USSR system, but he was also very naive. When he became party secretary, his task was to maintain party unity and keep Moscow happy, but at the same time satisfying the Czechoslovakian people, whose calls for reform were getting stronger. He assured Brezhnev that the pro-Moscow hardliners in Czechoslovakian Communist Party would not be purged, but the now freer press began to criticize President Novotny. After the corruption of the Novotny regime was revealed by the media, the president was forced to resign, on March 21st, 1968. Novotny was succeeded as president by General Ludvík Svoboda, who was reformist like Dubček and whose name literally meant freedom. His appointment as president kicked off events which became known as the Prague Spring. In early April 1968, an action program was published by the Czechoslovakian Communist Party detailing plans for liberal reform. This would give more social and economic freedoms to Czechoslovakians and recognize Slovaks and other ethnic minorities in the country. Reform then hit a new level as the media continued to expose the failures of Novotny's government. People began calling for fundamental party reform, and a special congress was scheduled for September 1968 at which the future of the Czechoslovakian Communist Party would be discussed. So, to summarise what we've learned today, in 1962 Czechoslovakia was struggling economically. Its leader, Andrei Novotny, had been humiliated by the criticism encouraged by Khrushchev's de-Stalinisation. Novotny was forced to resign as party secretary and president, bringing two reformers, Dubček and Svoboda, to power in Czechoslovakia. Under the reformist leaders, Czechoslovakia erupted in calls for widespread reform, and as the media continued to expose the corruption of the communist leadership, many called for a re-evaluation of the Communist Party itself. The appointment of Svoboda, the action plan for April 1968, and the scheduled special congress were part of a period of rapid reform and liberation known as the Prague Spring. Next lesson, we will look at the events and consequences of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time on GCSE History Lessons.